Let's talk about the time the U.S. Navy tried to blame a devastating catastrophe that claimed dozens of lives on a gay sailor's heartbreak. The only problem is that the sailor in question was not gay, not heartbroken, and not the cause of the catastrophe. Welcome back to Yesterqueers. My name's Amanda, and I'm a public historian who talks about queer history on the internet. On the morning of April 19, 1989, a battleship called the U.S.S. Iowa was preparing for a live fire drill as part of a fleet exercise about 300 miles off the coast of Puerto Rico. The ship had 3 gun turrets, each outfitted with 3 of the world's largest naval weapons, 16-inch guns capable of firing 2,700-pound projectiles up to 24 miles. Shortly after 9 a.m., all 3 turrets reported that they were manned and trained to starboard, ready to start firing. Captain Fred Mussoli, the ship's commanding officer, ordered Turret 1 to load and fire a 3-gun salvo. This was unusual. Normally, the ship's fire control officer would direct the loading and firing of the guns, but there was a vice admiral on board, so maybe Mussoli wanted to show off, or maybe they changed the protocol for the exercise. At 9:33 a.m., Turret 1's left gun misfired. One of the bags of powder failed to slide down far enough to connect to the primer in the breech. Naval SOP stated that the issue with the misfired gun should be resolved before continuing the exercise, but Mussoli ordered Turret 2 to load and fire a 3-gun salvo. Turret 2's right and left guns reported loaded and ready to fire within a minute, but gunner's mate Richard Lawrence on the center gun reported, "I have a problem here, I'm not ready yet." A few minutes later, over the turret phone system, crews working in all 3 turrets heard Senior Chief Reginald Ziegler say, "Fire, fire, fire in center gun, Turret 2, trying to contain it." At 9:53 a.m., the center gun in Turret 2 exploded, rocking the entire ship. The explosion collapsed doors and buckled bulkheads. A 3,000-degree fireball moving at 2,000 feet per second roared through the open breach, engulfing all 3 gun rooms and most of the lower levels of the turret. The resulting fire sucked the oxygen out of the lower levels of the turret, filled the turret with toxic fumes, including cyanide gas, and ignited 2,000 pounds of powder staged in the handling area, causing a second explosion. A third explosion came 9 minutes later, strong enough to blow the turret's 2-ton hatch off its hinges. There were 59 sailors in the turret at the time of the first explosion. Only 12 of them survived. The explosion on the U.S.S. Iowa remains one of the worst peacetime disasters in U.S. naval history. In the immediate aftermath of the explosion, a few heroes emerged, including a 21-year-old gunner's mate named Kendall Truitt. He'd been in the bottom floor of Turret 2's powder magazine, protected by the explosion-proof walls. He rushed up into the turret and realized that the powder bags in the flats were smoldering. There were 62 tons of powder stored in the turret, and if they exploded, the entire ship would go down, so Truitt knew they had to flood the turret with seawater. The sailor who tried to turn on the valves was new to the ship and wasn't sure he'd opened the right ones. So Truitt went back into the turret while the other 11 survivors evacuated. He opened the correct valves, closed the necessary doors and hatches to make sure the rest of the ship wouldn't flood, and stayed there to confirm that seawater was coming in, all while standing less than 10 feet from smoldering powder bags. He spent the next 15 hours guiding fire crews through the turret and helping to retrieve the bodies of his crewmates. Truitt wouldn't get confirmation until hours later that his best friend, gunner's mate Clayton Hardwig, was among the dead. Hardwig wasn't supposed to be part of the exercise. He was awaiting transfer orders, but he'd been made gun captain to the center gun at the last minute because the crew on that gun was very green. The Navy called Truitt a hero, lauding his bravery and saying that his quick thinking had saved the ship. He was the poster boy for American courage in the face of tragedy. The Navy had a problem in the wake of the U.S.S. Iowa explosion. Reagan had recommissioned 4 World War II-era battleships as part of his effort to fulfill his campaign promise for a 600-ship Navy. Battleships are perhaps the most recognizable and beloved vessels in U.S. naval history, and they formed the foundation of our military strategy for most of the 20th century. But critics were vocal about the wisdom of putting such old ships back on the water. This explosion shined a spotlight on that decision. There was no one left alive who could explain what happened, and crucial evidence was missing thanks to the seawater flood, the hasty removal of bodies, and the fact that Admiral Richard Milligan, who was tasked with the initial investigation, ordered the turret cleaned while the Iowa was en route back to Norfolk. So the Navy was fumbling with how to handle the tragedy and its investigation. Meanwhile, the 80s were a time of increased pressure from the DoD to ferret out gay people and remove them from military service. This was during the Cold War and those tense years leading up to the first Gulf War, so Republicans and Democrats were aligned on the need for national security. Only 3 people in Congress were even trying to overturn the ban on gays serving in the military: Jerry Studs and Barney Frank, both out gay men, and Pat Schroeder, the representative from Colorado who was the first woman to serve on the Armed Services Committee. They made little headway. Near the end of April, Clay Hartwig's sister Kathy wrote to her congressperson, Ohio Rep. Mary Rose Oker. She'd had lunch with Ken Truitt after the memorial and learned that one of Clay's life insurance policies named Truitt as the beneficiary. Kathy knew that Ken and Clay were close, but she thought the policy should pay out to her parents. So she wrote to Oker asking if there was anything she could do since the policy was through the Navy Federal Credit Union. I don't know if it's common practice now, but from Vietnam through at least the first Gulf War, it was not uncommon for sailors, especially those in dangerous jobs like gunners on battleships, to name each other beneficiary of their life insurance policies. Rep. Oker dutifully reached out to the Navy to see if they could change the beneficiary, and suddenly the investigation into the U.S.S. Iowa had a new focus. Hartwig must have been gay, and gay people were dangerous and unstable. Perhaps what had happened on the Iowa wasn't an accident at all, but the deliberate act of one crew member. Milligan called the Naval Investigative Service, an agency known for its single-minded focus in ferreting out gay sailors, and they started to build their case. I'm going to spare y'all most of the details because they are ridiculous and infuriating, but you can read all about them in the usual place. First, they decided that Truitt must be a jilted lover trying to collect on insurance money. NIS subjected Truitt and his wife to hours of aggressive and inappropriate questioning, including asking Carol if Hartwig had ever watched her have spicy adult time with her husband. When they couldn't find any evidence that the two were romantically linked, they leaked the rumor to the press, which of course ran with the salacious story. The U.S. Navy, which just weeks earlier had lauded Truitt as a hero and a shining example of naval excellence, destroyed his life and his career and the lives and careers of everyone close to him. Then they decided that Clay Hartwig must have an unrequited love for Truitt or perhaps another sailor, and was therefore so depressed that he decided to blow up his own battleship. Y'all, there are easier ways to do away with yourself or others on a giant ship in the middle of the open ocean. They questioned Hartwig's friends and family relentlessly, lying to one interview subject about what another had said, and pressured a sailor on the Iowa named David Smith to admit that Hartwig had hit on him, a claim that he recanted the very next morning. They even brought in FBI profilers to build a psych profile of Clay Hartwig as a depressed, suicidal loner who had meticulously planned and executed the explosion, even though there was nothing in his records that indicated anything of the sort. All the while, Ken Truitt, Hartwig's family, and other crew members of the Iowa were begging the media to let go of the tabloid story the Navy was trying to sell and focus on the very real safety concerns aboard the Iowa. Milligan submitted his report on July 15, 1989. In it, he concluded that in spite of substantial failures on the part of the commanding officer and executive officer, and in spite of numerous documented safety and personnel concerns, the explosion was a deliberate act most probably committed by Center Gun Chief Clay Hartwig. The safety violations and training deficiencies they'd uncovered were unrelated to the explosion. The report was so flimsy that the Armed Services Committees in both the Senate and the House held hearings. These were two chambers full of homophobes who believed that gay people were a danger to the U.S. military, and even they couldn't swallow the story that the Navy was telling. Those hearings led to testing at Sandia Labs that was supposed to prove there was no way the powder could have ignited accidentally, but instead proved the exact opposite. Sandia concluded that the explosion was most likely caused by an overram, powder being pushed too hard and too far into the breach, either by human error or mechanical malfunction. The Navy reopened the investigation in May of 1990 under the direction of Captain Joseph Maselli, who'd led the technical investigation the first time around. It didn't go much better. In October of 1991, after 2 years and $25 million worth of investigation, Admiral Frank Kelso held a Pentagon briefing to say that the cause of the explosion could not be determined. He kind of apologized to Hartwig's family, saying, "We did not have clear and convincing evidence that Clayton Hartwig caused this accident," and extending his sincere regrets. He said nothing about or to Ken Truitt. The attempted cover-up of the disaster on the U.S.S. Iowa is a shining example of how homophobia endangers everyone. Reagan recommissioned 4 Iowa-class battleships, the Iowa, the New Jersey, the Missouri, and the Wisconsin, all of which were susceptible to similar material, mechanical, or personnel training issues that could cause catastrophic accident. By looking for a scapegoat instead of the actual cause of the explosion on the U.S.S. Iowa, the U.S. Navy endangered thousands of sailors' lives. That's it for today. As always, more information, including sources and further reading, is available in the usual place.